You've probably met someone you instantly disliked. Maybe it was arrogance, maybe it was insecurity, maybe it was the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves, or something about their personality that irritated you immediately. But there is a disturbing psychological possibility most people never consider. The trait that bothers you most in other people may be a reflection of something you have rejected within yourself. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, he called this phenomenon projection. Projection occurs when parts of our own mind, thoughts, impulses, insecurities, or desires are pushed outside of awareness and then unconsciously attribute them to other people. In other words, the mind hides certain parts of itself and then sees those parts everywhere in the world. The result is a strange psychological illusion. We believe we are judging other people, but in reality, we are often reacting to something within ourselves. So tonight, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating and uncomfortable truths in psychology. Why the people who trigger you most may actually be revealing something about you. All right, before you can understand projection, you have to understand something deeper about the structure of the human mind. The mind is not designed to see everything about itself. It is designed to protect the identity you believe you are. Every person carries an internal image of themselves, a story about who they are. I'm a good person. I'm honest. I'm calm. I'm humble. I'm not the type of person who gets jealous. I'm not the type of person who gets angry. This self-image becomes the center of psychological stability. But here's the problem. Human beings are not simple creatures. Within every person exists a wide range of impulses, emotions, and potentials, some noble, some destructive, some uncomfortable. Aggression, envy, ambition, dominance, insecurity, competitiveness. These traits do not disappear just because they contradict your self-image. Instead, the mind does something very interesting. It rejects them from conscious awareness. When a thought, emotion, or impulse threatens the identity you believe about yourself, the mind quietly pushes it out of sight. Not destroyed, not removed, just hidden. And this is where the concept introduced by Carl Jung becomes important. Jung, he called this hidden psychology territory the shadow. And the shadow is made up of parts of yourself that your conscious identity refuses to accept. But here's the critical insight. Just because a part of yourself becomes unconscious doesn't mean it stops existing. In fact, the opposite often happens. The less aware you are of a trait within yourself, the more influence it tends to have over your behavior. A person who believes they are never angry, they might actually carry enormous amount of suppressed anger beneath the surface. A person who insists they are completely honest may unconsciously manipulate situations without realizing it. A person who prides themselves on being humble may secretly crave recognition more than anyone else in the room. But because these impulses threaten the identity they believe about themselves, the mind refuses to acknowledge them. So they remain hidden. And when something remains hidden long enough, the mind loses the ability to recognize it as part of itself. And this is where the real psychological shift begins. Because once a trait becomes unconscious, the mind still needs a place to put it. And that's when something fascinating happens. The mind begins to see that trait in other people instead. Not as a reflection, not as a possibility within the self, but as something that exists entirely outside of them. And this is the first step in the process we call projection. But before we go deeper into that, let's pause and consider something. Everyone has traits they reject. Everyone has parts of themselves they prefer not to see. The question is not whether you have a shadow. The question is, which parts of yourself have you decided cannot possibly belong to you? Because the traits you reject most strongly are often the ones hidden just beneath the surface. Once a trait has been rejected by the conscious mind, the psyche faces a problem. The trait still exists. It still carries energy. It still influences perception. It still seeks expression. But because the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge it, the psyche must find another way to deal with it. And this is where one of the most fascinating mechanisms of the human mind appears. It's projection. Projection occurs when the mind takes something that exists internally and unconsciously attributes it to someone else. In simple terms, instead of recognizing a trait within yourself, the mind sees that trait in the outside world. But here's what makes projection so powerful. It is not a conscious decision. You don't wake up and decide to project. The process happens automatically, below the level of awareness. The mind quietly relocates the trait from inside you to outside you. And once that happens, the mind begins to react to that trait as if it truly belongs to someone else. All right, let's walk through how this process unfolds. First, a trait appears in the psyche. It could be anger, jealousy, ambition, dominance, insecurity, competitiveness. But if that trait conflicts with your identity, the story you believe about who you are, the mind rejects it. Step 2, the trait moves into the unconscious. It becomes part of the shadow. And number 3, the mind begins scanning the external world for something that resembles that hidden trait. And when it finds someone who reflects it, a powerful emotional reaction appears. And suddenly that person seems irritating. That person suddenly is arrogant or dishonest or selfish or manipulative. But the emotional intensity of the reaction is often disproportionate. The reaction is not just mild dislike. It feels personal. It feels charged. It feels like something about that person deeply bothers you in a way that is difficult to explain. That intensity is often a clue that projection is occurring. Because when the mind encounters a trait that exists in the shadow, it reacts with unusual force. This is why projection can create some of the most confusing interactions in everyday life. A person may accuse others of being manipulative while subtly manipulating situations themselves. Someone may constantly complain about arrogant people while secretly believing they deserve more recognition than anyone else around them. Another person may judge others harshly for being selfish while quietly placing their own needs above everyone else. But because the trait exists in the unconscious, the person genuinely believes the problem exists entirely in other people, that they cannot see the internal source. This is what makes projection such a powerful psychological illusion. It allows the mind to protect its identity while still expressing the hidden trait indirectly. But there is another reason projection exists, and it may surprise you, because projection is not only about negative traits. Sometimes the mind projects positive qualities as well: strength, confidence, leadership, creativity, potential. When someone has suppressed these qualities within themselves, they may become fascinated by people who embody them. They admire them. They idolize them. They become drawn towards them without fully understanding why. Because the qualities they see in that person are actually reflections of something within themselves that has not yet been recognized. In this way, projection does two things at once. It hides what you reject, and it reveals what you have not yet accepted. Which brings us to the next question. If projection is happening unconsciously, why do certain people trigger it so strongly? Why do some individuals pass through your life unnoticed, while others provoke intense reactions almost instantly? To understand that, we need to look at something called psychological triggers. One of the most revealing aspects of projection is this: not everyone triggers it. You can meet hundreds of people in a week and feel completely neutral towards most of them. They pass through your life without any strong emotional reaction. But every once in a while, you encounter someone who immediately provokes something inside of you. It could be irritation, suspicion, jealousy, dislike, or even a strange fascination that you can't fully explain. And the reaction often happens almost instantly, within minutes, sometimes in seconds. What's interesting is that other people in the same room may not react to that person at all. To them, that individual seems normal, but to you, something about them stands out sharply. And this is where the psychology becomes interesting, because strong emotional reactions rarely appear without a reason. The mind does not produce intense emotional responses randomly. When someone triggers a powerful reaction inside you, it usually means something deeper has been activated. And very often, that activation is connected to the shadow. According to the psychological framework developed by Carl Jung, certain individuals act like mirrors for unconscious traits. Not everyone reflects those traits. Only specific personalities do. For an example, A person who secretly struggles with feeling of inferiority may feel intense irritation towards someone who appears extremely confident. A person who suppresses their own ambition may feel resentment towards someone who openly pursues success. Someone who was taught that anger is unacceptable may feel deeply uncomfortable around people who express strong opinions or exert themselves boldly. On the surface, the reaction looks like a judgment of the other person, but psychologically, something else may be happening. The trait that exists within the shadow is becoming activated by recognition. Not conscious recognition, unconscious recognition. The mind notices the trait, but instead of seeing it internally, it attaches the emotional response to the person displaying it. This is why certain people seem to get under your skin, because they're activating something that already exists within your own psyche. Sometimes it is a trait you suppress. Sometimes it's a trait you fear. And sometimes it's a trait you secretly wish you could express. This is why projection can appear in two different ways: negative projection and positive projection. Negative projection is easier to recognize. It appears as criticism, irritation, or moral judgment. You see a trait on someone else and feel compelled to condemn them. But positive projection is just as powerful. Sometimes you meet someone and feel an immediate sense of admiration. You see them as exceptionally strong, talented, confident, or even intelligent. You place them on some type of a pedestal or something. But what many people fail to realize is that that admiration can sometimes be a form of projection as well. The qualities you see in that person may actually represent untapped potential within yourself. Your psyche recognizes something. It recognizes something that it's capable of, but it's not yet fully accepted. So it appears more comfortable placing that quality onto someone else. In this way, the people who irritate you the most and the people who inspire you the most may both be acting as mirrors. Mirrors reflecting different parts of your psyche. Parts of you that have been rejected, parts you have suppressed, or parts you may not have yet allowed yourself to become. And this is why the people who trigger you emotionally are often the most psychologically significant individuals you encounter. They reveal something about you, even if you're not ready yet, if you're not ready to see it. But the mirror effect does not stop at individual triggers. In fact, it operates on a much larger scale in everyday life, because sometimes life itself begins to feel like a mirror reflecting patterns that repeat again and again. And understanding that phenomenon brings us to the next idea. At some point in life, many people begin to notice something strange. The same types of problems keep appearing. Different people, different situations, different environments, yet the pattern feels familiar. A person may repeatedly encounter dishonest business partners. Another may continually attract manipulative relationships. Someone else may constantly feel surrounded by people who underestimate them. On the surface, these patterns appear to be bad luck or coincidence, but psychology suggests something deeper may be happening. Human projection is not neutral. The mind doesn't simply observe reality the way a camera records images. Instead, the mind filters reality through internal beliefs, expectations, and unconscious patterns. These filters, they shape what you notice, how you interpret events, and how you respond to people. And over time, those internal patterns begin to create consistent external experiences. And this is sometimes referred to as the mirror effect. Not in a mystical sense, but in a psychological sense. Your inner world influences how you perceive and interact with the outer world, which means certain patterns tend to repeat themselves until the internal patterns change. For example, if someone carries an unconscious belief that people cannot be trusted, their mind becomes extremely sensitive to signs of dishonesty. They notice small inconsistencies in behavior. They become suspicious more quickly. They interpret neutral action as potential deception. And over time, this perception changes how they behave around others. They may become guarded, defensive, distant. And ironically, this can influence the behavior of the people around them. Because when someone senses distrust, they may respond with distance and secrecy, which reinforces the original belief. The person now feels validated. You see, people can't be trusted. But what they may not realize is that their own internal expectations shaped the interaction from the beginning. And this is one example of how the mind can create self-reinforcing patterns. And these patterns often operate quietly in the background, below conscious awareness. The same thing can happen in other areas of life. A person who secretly doubts their own value may repeatedly enter situations where they are undervalued. And it's not because the world has singled them out for mistreatment, but because their internal belief influences the choices they make and the signals they send to others. They may tolerate disrespect longer than they should. They may hesitate to assert themselves. They may avoid opportunities where their value could be recognized. And over time, the pattern repeats, and it begins to feel like the world is reflecting a certain message back to them. You are not valued. But in reality, the reflection may be coming from an internal belief that has never been challenged. This is why the mirror effect can feel so powerful, because life begins to look like a reflection and something happens internally. The people who appear in your life, the conflicts that repeat, the opportunities you pursue or avoid, often connect to deeper patterns inside the psyche. And once someone begins to recognize these patterns, a new question naturally appears. If the mind is projecting and filtering reality in this way? Is it possible to become aware of these patterns? And if it is, can those patterns be changed? And this question leads directly into the most important part of this conversation. Because once someone becomes aware of projection, they gain access to something extremely powerful: the ability to reclaim the shadow. And that process is where real psychological transformation begins. Once a person begins to understand projection, a very different kind of awareness becomes possible. Instead of immediately reacting to people, judging them, or emotionally responding without reflection, they begin asking a different question, a quieter question, a more uncomfortable question. Why did that affect me so strongly? Not, why is this person like that? But why did I react the way I did? This shift may seem small, but psychologically it is enormous. Because the moment you begin questioning your own reaction, you step outside of the automatic pattern. Instead of projecting unconsciously, you start observing your own mind. And observation creates distance, and distance creates awareness. And awareness is the first step towards reclaiming the shadow. Reclaiming the shadow doesn't mean becoming everything you once rejected. It does not mean embracing negative behavior or abandoning moral judgment. What it means is something far more important. It means recognizing the parts of yourself that you previously denied. For example, a person who constantly criticizes, arrogance, and others may eventually discover something surprising. What they call arrogance may actually be a distorted reflection of their own suppressed confidence. They were taught that confidence is dangerous, that standing out invites criticism, that speaking boldly makes others uncomfortable. So instead of expressing that strength openly, they push it into the shadow. Then, when they encounter someone who expresses confidence freely, the reaction appears as irritation. But the irritation is not really about the other person. It's about a disowned part of the self trying to surface. And once this is recognized, something interesting happens. The emotional charge begins to weaken. The reaction becomes less intense because the mind no longer needs to project itself. It no longer needs to protect itself from something it has already acknowledged. And this is one of the reasons self-awareness is so powerful. The shadow loses much of its control once it becomes conscious. The traits that once appeared threatening begin to look different. Sometimes they reveal hidden strengths. Sometimes they reveal suppressed creativity. Sometimes they reveal parts of the personality that were never fully developed. This is why psychological growth often feels uncomfortable, because reclaiming the shadow requires honesty. Not surface level honesty, but deep internal honesty. You have to be willing to look at aspects of yourself that you previously avoided. You have to admit traits you may not feel proud of. Ambition, envy, aggression, the desire for power, the need for recognition. Many people pretend these traits do not exist within them, but suppressing them does not eliminate them. It simply pushes them deeper into the unconscious, where they begin influencing behavior indirectly. But when those traits are acknowledged consciously, they can be redirected. That's when ambition becomes discipline. That's when aggression becomes assertiveness. The desire for recognition becomes a drive for achievement. Energy that once operated unconsciously becomes something you can shape deliberately. This is the true purpose of shadow integration, not elimination. It's integration, because the most stable personalities are not built by denying human nature. They're built by understanding it. And once someone begins integrating the shadow, their perceptions of other people changes dramatically. The judgments soften. The emotional reactions become less automatic. And something unexpected begins to emerge. It's clarity. Because when projection fades, you begin to see people more accurately. Not as reflections of your internal conflicts, but as individuals with their own complexes. And this level of clarity creates a different kind of strength. The kind that does not depend on reacting emotionally to every situation. The kind that allows you to move through life with greater control over your own mind. But there is still one final piece to this conversation, because projection does not disappear overnight. Even highly self-aware individuals still experience it. The difference is that they recognize it faster. The moment you begin noticing projection is the moment you begin regaining control over your perception. Most people go through life believing they see reality clearly. They believe their opinions are objective. Their reactions are justified. Their judgments are accurate. But psychology has revealed something deeply unsettling. Human perception is not neutral. It is interpretive. Your mind is constantly filtering reality through memory, belief, emotion, and unconscious pattern, which means many of the things you react to in others are not purely about them. They're about what your mind is projecting onto them. This is why two people can witness the exact same situation and walk away with completely different interpretations. They're not seeing the same thing. They are seeing reality through different internal filters. And most of the time, people are not aware of these filters. They're just not aware that they exist. But there is a moment, a very specific moment, where everything begins to change. It is the moment you catch yourself mid-reaction. Not after the argument, not after the judgment, but during the emotional response itself. Someone says something that irritates you, and instead of immediately reacting, a thought appears, a small interruption in the pattern, a question. Why did that bother me so much? That moment is the crack in the projection. Because the instant you begin examining your reaction, you move from unconscious response to conscious observation. And observation changes everything. Instead of being controlled by the reaction, you begin studying it. Instead of assuming the other person is the problem, you begin examining the internal trigger. Sometimes you will discover something surprising. What bothered you was never about the other person at all. It was about something unresolved within you. Maybe a belief, an insecurity, a suppressed trait, a shadow that had been operating quietly beneath awareness. And once you recognize that, the power of projection begins to weaken, because projection depends on unconsciousness. It depends on you believing the reaction is purely external. The moment awareness enters the process, the illusion begins to collapse. You start seeing your own mind at work. You start recognizing patterns in your reactions. You start noticing the same emotional triggers appearing in different situations. And slowly, your relationship with your own thoughts begins to change. Instead of identifying with every reaction, you start observing them. And instead of assuming every judgment is true, you begin questioning the filter behind it. This doesn't make life easier. In many ways, it makes it more challenging, because self-awareness removes the comfort of blaming everything on the outside world. But it also gives you something most people never develop: psychological control. The ability to see your own mental patterns clearly. The ability to interrupt automatic reactions. The ability to shape your internal world deliberately. And once someone develops this level of awareness, their perception of life becomes very different. Conflicts look different. The people look different. Even their own thoughts look different, because they no longer assume every emotional response is reality. They understand something most people never learn. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is question the voice inside of your own mind. Most people spend their lives trying to control the world around them, but very few ever learn to control the lenses through which they see it. Projection is one of the hidden forces shaping human behavior. And once you begin recognizing it, you begin reclaiming something extremely powerful: your perception, your reactions, your awareness. Because the moment you stop projecting the shadow outward, you finally gain the ability to understand it. And when that happens, the mind stops working against you and starts working for you. Most people will never reach that level of awareness. But if you're here, you're already starting to see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can never completely unsee it. This is results, and the work is just beginning.